Hello, everyone. Thanks to all who have joined us so far. The line should be muted to all except those who will be presenting. Today, we're going to hear from Brigadier General Jeff Van Epps, Northwestern Division Commander for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Julie Ahman, Acting Chief of the Columbia Basin Water Management Division for USACE, and Eric Rothwell, the Bureau of Reclamation's Columbia Pacific Northwest Columbia River Coordinator. Again, we are only providing information at this point in the process, so we will not be taking questions or comments, and we are recording this meeting. And now I will pass it over to Brigadier General Van Epps.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tom, and welcome, and thanks to everybody who's joining us this evening. Again, my name is Brigadier General Jeff Van Epps, and I'm the commander of the Northwestern Division of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I'm going to be joined tonight by Julie Ahman, who is our Corps' Chief of Water Management for the Columbia River Basin, as well as Eric Rothwell from the Bureau of Reclamation. And just by way of background, since 2018, the United States has been engaging with Canada on negotiation of the Columbia River Treaty regime. Now, the Department of State serves as the lead agency for negotiations with support from other federal agencies, which include Bonneville Power Administration, the National Marine Fisheries Service, the Department of the Interior, represented by Bureau of Reclamation, Corps of Engineers, as well as representatives from the Columbia River Basin tribes. And in August, the chief negotiator for the United States, Jill Smale, provided a public update on negotiations. The United States remains committed to those negotiations, and we're hopeful that we'll find common ground with Canada. However, components of the treaty changed in September 2024, which could impact the way in which we operate for flood risk management. There are changes in the treaty specific to Canadian reservoirs that will start in September 2024. And the increased uncertainty of those changes may lead to deeper drafts at Grand Coulee, as well as a reduction in some flexibilities we've had in the past. So we cannot stress enough that life safety is paramount to the Corps and to the Bureau of Reclamation. So what does this all mean? Without a new agreement providing otherwise, the U.S. will not be able to direct the operation of space in Canada until the forecast indicates to the Corps' water managers that it is necessary to do so. The U.S. will still have a right to access space in Canada, but it may be different than how we do it today. And we refer to this as real-time operations. It is imperative that we develop plans for future operations with and without reaching an agreement with Canada on a modernized Columbia River Treaty regime. Today, the Corps of Engineers and Bureau of Reclamation come to you to talk about those plans. We're calling the post-2024 operations that result in a need to call in the Canadian space real-time operations for flood risk management. And this means that we'll have to adapt to changes in Canadian Columbia River Treaty project operations, but we will retain the right to utilize space in Canada for flood risk management purposes. We recognize there may be interest in the status of negotiations with Canada, but we have to ask you to direct those specific questions to the Department of State, who's the lead federal agency for those negotiations. During this session, we're focused on post-2024 flood risk management operations and the role of real-time operations here in the United States. We're committed to engaging with you on this topic and sharing details in future meetings as we learn more about the future of our operations. Can I get the next slide, please? Thanks. So these are the topics that we'll cover today, and you'll hear from both the Corps and from Reclamation throughout this brief. For those of you who have called in and may not be able to see the presentation, those topics are as follows. We'll start with a little bit of background, provide an overview of the treaty. We'll get into the operational implications to the system of some potential treaty outcomes. We'll talk about potential effects. We'll touch on environmental compliance, and then we'll tell you what little we know about the path forward today. Next slide, please. Before we talk about what the future may hold, we'd like to take a moment to remind you of the history of this area. While it's not comprehensive, it provides good context for the changes moving forward. We have to begin with the indigenous people who've lived in the area long before development of the modern-day system of dams on the Columbia River main stem and its tributaries. Tribes in the United States and indigenous nations in Canada have occupied the lands of the basin since time immemorial, and they've relied on the resources of this river system to support their respective cultures. The map on this slide shows the tribes within the U.S. portion of the basin, and these tribes continue to exercise rights and to rely on this system to support their cultures today, making them an important partner in the operation of the Columbia River system. Next slide, please. So it's important to look back at development in the basin to show how much things have changed over time. These photos are of the same area in Northeast Portland along the Columbia River. They illustrate the development since 1930, before the federal government built the dams in the basin. These areas are in the historic floodplain of the Columbia River. The negotiation of the Columbia River Treaty and congressional authorization of the system of dams anticipated continued development in the region and an intentional plan of improvement based on the rational distribution of storage to be located where it was needed to achieve multiple purposes, both local and system-wide. What's more, both countries made a conscious choice to work together in perpetuity to meet U.S. flood risk management needs using Canadian dams rather than having the U.S. build the infrastructure we needed just in the U.S. alone. Next slide. These are photos of Swan Island in Portland, near the confluence of the Columbia and Willamette Rivers, comparing 1966 to current conditions. We've provided the red line there for reference, and it's the same location in both maps. Both of these areas or both of these photos are of an area in the historic floodplain. Just take note how much the area has changed from undeveloped areas to industrial uses over time. Next slide. Before the construction and operation of the Columbia River system of dams we know today, flooding occurred regularly. The construction of these dams has reduced flooding at many locations in the basin. This map shows a few of the areas that were subject to regular flooding prior to dam construction. The Tri-Cities in Washington, the Portland-Vancouver area, and Longview, Washington were some of the key cities that were prone to flood damages, as demonstrated by these images of the 1948 Columbia River flood. And there were also flooding issues in Canada, primarily near the community of Trail. Next slide. One of the turning points in the development of the Columbia River Basin was the 1948 Columbia River flood event, better known as the Vanport flood. In late May and June of 1948, flooding occurred throughout the basin because of higher than average snowpack, low elevation snow, rapid warming, and precipitation. This flood killed around 100 people in the basin, and it caused extensive damage throughout the region. It essentially destroyed Vanport, Oregon, a city of 20 to 30,000 people. That city was part of the metropolitan area of Portland, between Portland and the Columbia River. This flood also damaged homes, farms, and levees from British Columbia all the way down to Astoria, Oregon. And the catastrophe spurred the U.S. government to seek solutions for basin flooding. After this event, the United States invested heavily in two efforts. First, strengthening of the levee system along the Columbia River, and second, the construction of new reservoirs upstream that could capture floodwaters before they caused catastrophic damage. At this point, I'll turn it over to my partner, Julie Ammon, to continue the presentation for the Corps of Engineers. Julie, over to you.
Thank you, sir. Today, many of the dams on the Columbia River Basin provide flood risk management benefits. While flood risk management is a key objective, the dams in the basin, which are also referred to as projects, were built for many purposes, not just flood risk management. These include hydropower generation, navigation, irrigation, fish and wildlife, and recreation. The treaty recognized this and does not require those other purposes to be abandoned in order to maintain flood risk management needs in the U.S. The Columbia River system in the United States has two types of projects, storage and run-of-river. Federal water managers coordinate operations at the dams that provide many overlapping operational functions, such as power generation, and each dam is unique. Storage projects such as Grand Coulee Dam and Libby Dam in the United States, and the three Canadian projects, Duncan, Arrow, and Mica dams, which were built as part of the treaty, can capture floodwaters and reduce flows downstream. Run-of-river projects such as Bonneville Dam or Chief Joseph Dam do not provide direct flood risk management, as their reservoirs cannot be lowered to capture significant amounts of water. Dams that operate as part of a multi-purpose system can successfully fulfill many objectives at the same time. This includes flood risk management, water supply, hydropower, navigation, fish and wildlife, recreation, and other uses. Each objective has its own set of needs and constraints, and dam operators must balance those competing priorities. The range of operations that can meet all objectives is often quite small, as shown in the figure. Sometimes all objectives cannot be fully met. The federal agencies work with regional stakeholders to discuss adaptive management and trade-offs when they cannot meet all objectives. For instance, changes to operations for flood risk management could have impacts on other operational purposes, such as navigation or recreation. If the Canadian operation becomes more unpredictable, it will further increase the difficulty of meeting all objectives within the United States. The next series of maps will show the development of reservoirs in the basin throughout time. Each circle on the map is a reservoir, and the size of each circle shows how much reservoir storage is available in each reservoir in millions of acre-feet to manage flooding. U.S. projects are shown with blue circles. This map shows the amount of storage available at the time of the 1948 flood. Grand Coulee Dam, which formed Lake Roosevelt, was constructed at this time, but it was not yet operated specifically for flood risk management. You can see that it had the only significant flood risk management, or FRM, space in the watershed. Due to the lack of storage to capture runoff, river flows were very close to what they would have been in an undammed system during this event. This map shows the amount of storage available in 1961, shortly before the Columbia River Treaty was signed. When compared to the previous map, you can see 12 major new dams were constructed between 1948 and 61. This map shows the amount of storage available today in both the United States and Canada. Canadian projects are shown with red circles. When compared to the previous map, you can see that 15 major new dams were constructed in the basin in the United States and Canada between 1961 and 2023. You can now see Mica, Arrow, and Duncan dams in Canada with relatively large storage. The portion of the basin in Canada may appear small. However, the Canadian portion is responsible for a large share of the floodwaters in the U.S. due to the heavy snow that accumulates in the Northern Rockies. During the 1948 flood, nearly 40% of the flow at Portland originated in Canada. This flood directly informed the nature and extent of the ongoing flood risk management rights the U.S. has in Canada under the treaty. So how did those dams on the map in Canada come into being? In 1944, the countries started working together on coordinated development of the Columbia River. As mentioned in the previous slides, the catastrophic 1948 flood provided more motivation to reduce the impacts of damaging floods. While Canada makes up only 15% of the basin, it provides 35% of the flow on average. The Columbia River Treaty entered into force in 1964. The treaty was developed with two main objectives: hydropower and flood risk management, and it makes other benefits possible as well. As part of the treaty, the United States agreed to pay Canada upfront for assured flood space in the Canadian treaty dams for 60 years. The Canadian treaty dams were completed over several years. Duncan Dam in the Kootenay Basin in 1967, Kinleyside Dam or Arrow Lakes on the Columbia River in 1968, and Mica Dam on the Columbia in 1973. Pre-planned flood risk management operations for this pre-purchased space in Canada end on September 16, 2024, 60 years after the treaty entered into force. We continue to negotiate with Canada, seeking a modernized agreement, and we were talking with you today in preparation for the potential post-2024 scenarios. Changes in flows and project operations are likely to occur after September 2024. Even with the modernized treaty regime, Canada is likely to operate its projects differently than today. What we don't know at this point is exactly how the flows will change. So just to be clear, the Columbia River Treaty does not expire after September 16, 2024. The Canadian reservoir storage is still there, and hydropower operation coordination with Canada will continue. The treaty includes a provision for continued access to flood risk management space in Canada after that date. However, the way the U.S. accesses the Canadian storage for flood risk management changes in September 2024. We want to be very specific here. This slide is not about treaty modernization negotiations with Canada. Rather, it represents the existing treaty. Instead of requiring a pre-planned amount of flood risk management space available, the treaty allows for operations to be handled in real time after September 2024, if the countries do not come to other arrangements. The bar graphs show the breakdown of storage between the United States and Canada. The blue part shows the total active reservoir storage in the U.S., The red part shows the storage in Canada that can be accessed by the U.S. for flood risk management, but only under certain conditions. These conditions change in September 2024. The green part shows how much of the storage in Canada is currently dedicated for flood risk management, also known as assured space. Until September 2024, the United States has at least 8.95 million acre-feet of dedicated storage or assured space in Canada for flood risk management. To conceptualize this volume of water, this is almost double the amount of water in Lake Roosevelt behind Grand Coulee Dam. After September 2024, there is no requirement for dedicated space in Canada for flood risk management per the existing treaty. After September 2024, we can manage flood risk with real-time operations if the countries do not agree to other arrangements. This means that Canada may have less storage space available for U.S. flood risk management due to how they're operating their dams for their own priorities, which could increase the rate of draft at Grand Coulee and decrease the flexibility in the United States. Our plans to mitigate for this loss of storage space could have other impacts to various areas, including recreation, irrigation, et cetera. This real-time flood risk management operation is sometimes referred to as called upon. For this and the next slide, I'll summarize operational changes that could be part of real-time flood risk management starting after September 2024 in terms of elevations behind Grand Coulee Dam in Lake Roosevelt. Then we'll share various impacts that could be associated with those changes. This diagram shows potential daily elevations at Lake Roosevelt through time. The blue line at the top of the shaded area represents average water levels at Lake Roosevelt and Grand Coulee under today's operation. The blue line represents the average for each day of the year based on model runs covering conditions of the historic period. Losing the flexibility provided previously by pre-planned flood risk management in Canada may lead to changes in system storage operations in the U.S., primarily at Grand Coulee Dam. The yellow line at the bottom of the shaded area is the lower bound of average Grand Coulee elevations for a potential worst-case scenario, and the red space represents the uncertainty of operations at Grand Coulee Dam for system flood risk management in response to potential changes in Canada. Without an agreed-upon modernized Columbia River Treaty regime, changes are uncertain and less predictable. You can see that on average, Lake Roosevelt would be drafted deeper during late winter and the runoff season. Changes to Grand Coulee Dam operations and Lake Roosevelt elevations could impact many resources, which Reclamation will discuss later in the presentation. Changes to Canadian and U.S. projects to meet system flood risk management needs may also impact flows in the Columbia River. This graph shows an example of how flows might change under real-time flood risk management. The line shows the actual flows on the Columbia River for a given water year under current day conditions, and the shaded area shows how flows might change under real-time flood risk management operations after September 2024. These flow changes are uncertain, but could impact several resources that will be discussed further. Changes in the FRM space in Canada and changes in Canadian operations will possibly result in impacts to the following resources that I'm going to talk about. Different people will have different interests in relation to the changes that may be coming with this new paradigm. We want to make sure people from a variety of backgrounds and perspectives understand potential changes. The following slides will describe some possible ways conditions could change. Again, the U.S. is working hard through negotiations with Canada to avoid these impacts. However, we have a responsibility to discuss future operations with the public. For each of these slides with possible impacts, a red circled area is shown on the map where the changes could mostly be seen. Levee systems, also known as dikes, act as barriers between the Columbia River and the built environment. If floods become more severe, the levee systems could be stressed more and could potentially fail. Even for high water events that don't breach the levee, other damages may occur. More frequent high water events can cause erosion and bank sloughing, which leads to repair and maintenance costs. If flooding becomes more severe or frequent, residential, municipal, and commercial development in the floodplain would be put at higher risk. This includes areas both behind and not behind a levee. Individual property owners could be affected differently. FEMA manages the National Flood Insurance Program. If the chance of flooding increases, this could lead FEMA to remap existing floodplains, which could increase the number of properties that are required to purchase flood insurance. Additionally, flood insurance could become more expensive. Planning continues for an I-5 bridge replacement, and the current span is a drawbridge. When Columbia River levels are high, the bridge must be raised to allow ships to go through. These bridge lifts disrupt traffic and can cause long delays. If Columbia River levels are higher more often, bridge lifts may occur more frequently and for boats with a lower height. Additionally, people who live in floating homes on the river are intimately aware of river levels because variations affect their daily lives. If there's reduced flood risk management coordination with Canada, river levels may fluctuate more. Floating homes have also broken loose from their moorings in past flood events. If the chance of flooding becomes higher in the future, this could be more of a risk. A large amount of commerce uses the Columbia River Navigation Channel. Much of this traffic is between Portland, Vancouver, and the Pacific Ocean, but there's considerable traffic on the Columbia River up to the Tri-Cities area. Much of this traffic continues up the Snake River to Lewiston, Idaho. Higher costs may be incurred if more tugboats are required to push against the strong currents that occur with higher flows on the Columbia River. The lower Snake River dams are typically a point of discussion whenever we engage on the Columbia River. The operation of the lower Snake River dams are not affected by Columbia River flood risk management operations. Likewise, they have no storage aside from their operating pools and thus have no bearing on main stem flood risk management. Therefore, they are outside the scope of this project. Changes to flows and storage project operations may have an impact on power generation. These changes are uncertain, and Bonneville Power Administration may need to adapt its planning based on this uncertainty. I'll now turn it over to Eric Rothwell from the Bureau of Reclamation, who will present the next few slides.
Thank you, Julie, and good evening. I will continue the description of potential implications to resources, starting with agriculture. And changes to the Columbia River system operations for flood risk management could impact irrigation water delivery. This could be affected through the pumping plant at Grand Coulee Dam, which was designed to operate at projected levels. However, if we rely on Grand Coulee to provide more space by lowering Lake Roosevelt elevations, it may have effects on pumping water to Banks Lake. This could impact water delivery to the Columbia Basin Project. These impacts could include the timing and cost of pumping water from Lake Roosevelt to Banks Lake, and these changes could impact the timing of water delivery and could result in changes to Banks Lake operations. Banks Lake could be seasonally drafted to lower elevations to meet irrigation demands. Relying on real-time flood risk management would result in longer drawdowns of Lake Roosevelt, and the average depth of the drawdowns would be greater. These longer, deeper drawdowns could expose more cultural and archaeological sites than under current operations. When archaeological sites are exposed in the drawdown zone, this leaves them more vulnerable to shoreline erosion, mast wasting, and looting. Changes to flows could affect different species of anadromous fish in different ways, with effects being positive or potentially negative, depending on whether flow increases or decreases during a particular month. Flows coming across the border from Canada can be re-regulated or reshaped at Grand Coulee, in part to support spawning, rearing, and migration of anadromous fish downstream. Although deeper drawdowns for flood risk management could limit the flexibility to shape flows to benefit fish populations downstream. For resident fish management in Lake Roosevelt, these potentially lower reservoir levels may have negative effects such as decreased spawning habitat availability, perched tributaries, or increased entrainment of fish downstream through the dam. The recreation quality and access to water-based recreation could also be impacted during periods of low reservoir elevations. Boats would be unable to launch when their minimum elevation requirements are not met. Recreation sites would be affected differently based on the local topography and existing infrastructure. And some recreation sites may see increased crowding when accessibility of others become limited. Impacts to recreation visitation would be most pronounced during peak recreation months that coincide with low reservoir levels. Lower reservoirs would result in increased risks to boaters because of the exposure of mudflats and the relative elevation of submerged hazards. Increased flows also affect boater safety within the river corridor. The Inchelium Gifford Ferry on Lake Roosevelt is operated by the Colville Confederated Tribe on behalf of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The ferry connects Inchelium with State Route 25 in Stevens County. The ferry operation relies on Lake Roosevelt elevations, and the ferry becomes inoperable at low reservoir levels. So this potential increased drawdown of Lake Roosevelt for flood risk management could impact these ferry operations. This would result in more frequent and longer duration periods where the ferry is inoperable. When the ferry is out of service, users, mostly members of the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation, must travel significantly farther for access to school and emergency services. Currently, outages are relatively infrequent and short in duration, but this could change with additional reliance on Grand Coulee and Lake Roosevelt for flood risk management. I'll now turn this back over to the Corps for the remainder of our slides. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Eric. And just 3 more slides before we wrap this up. So I'm sure some of you are wondering how these changes may affect environmental compliance for operating the system. Compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, and other relevant environmental laws is covered currently under a 2020 Environmental Impact Statement and Record of Decision. We have not initiated any additional or supplemental environmental compliance at this point, but we will continue to evaluate the need for it as we better understand future Canadian operations. And if we determine additional environmental compliance is needed, we'll include public involvement as part of that process. Next slide. There we go. So we realize that at this point, we've only provided you concepts, and we anticipate you'll probably want information than what we've shared this evening. At this point, we just simply don't know the actual changes in reservoir operations or potential changes in flooding because we don't know how Canada will be operating their system. Looking forward, we are working with Canada to finalize a treaty operating plan for operating year 2025. We remain hopeful that treaty negotiations will be completed soon. We're committed to continue to engage with you and inform you as we move forward and more information comes available. Last slide, please. Okay, so just finally want to end with a note of thanks. I appreciate you taking the time to attend today. Please note the online resources listed here on the slide for general Columbia River operations information, as well as treaty negotiation updates. And again, we look forward to speaking with you on this topic in future sessions. Thanks for joining us this evening. Tom, back to you.
All right, thank you, Brigadier General Van Epps, Julie, and Eric. And thanks to everyone who joined us tonight. We appreciate your interest. For more information or future updates, visit our website at www.nwd.usace.army.mil.